for a fact that we only have 10%. If we look at top 100, Europe has around 10% of those companies. And you need to go quite far down the line to find the companies. We have a few that are extremely valuable. We've just heard that we're not at the forefront, but of course we're determined not to give up. So the first round, I'm going to do a little bit on the big picture, and then we're going to go a little bit. We're going to do a poll for the policy measures and what you are saying, and then we will address, how can we actually work with this problem. So Dennis, of course, welcome. Thank you so much. You've been deeply involved, of course, in the economic security strategy. Can you tell us a little bit more about, the 3 Ps? It's promote, partner, and protect. And what are you trying to do with this strategy?
Thanks for having me. Look, I think it's good that you start with the 3 Ps because I note what you say out of the study on the need for balance, right? A balance between openness and, where necessary, in pockets, protection, and balance indeed between the promote and the protect arm. And I would argue that the 3rd P, the partner part, is not an afterthought. It's absolutely essential because at the end of the day, if we're talking about the competitiveness of key sectors which have a European footprint, competitiveness can only be global competitiveness. If not, the internal market is too small in any case to ensure global competitiveness. So the balance between different pillars of that strategy are a well understood need, and I think that it moves forward now at different speeds. There are different work streams. We are in the implementation of the economic security strategy of June 2023, and perhaps that has created some confusion. In January, we have taken forward a package of measures, initiatives, hard law, soft law, but in the protect area. But that doesn't mean that it is taking over or taking precedence from the promote side. I think it's essentially about giving meaning to what does it mean to de-risk the economy where we need to de-risk it, and at the same time continue to maximize the opportunities from openness and integration, global economic integration. That is what underpins, I think, an economic security strategy, to make it super simple. It means that what we're looking to do is ensure up our competitiveness, where necessary, level the playing field as well, which is important. That's why there are trade and investment policy type issues that come into bear, which is my bit of the puzzle. But it certainly doesn't mean that we want to create artificially global economic fragmentation. I think on the contrary, the real risk, if you move from a pure logic of efficiency in international economic relations to one where you have an element of efficiency, an element of resilience, security, is that you have too much of a pendulum swing, and if you have too much of a pendulum swing, you're going to create unnecessary global economic fragmentation. I think that's the one thing that we want to avoid doing, because that's inconsistent with the European interest. Maybe that's a bit broad, but I'm happy to elaborate, of course, on the tools if you want.
So when can I just one follow-up question? When you say promote, so we of course say there is a 4th P that is missing, right? Private sector. So, but if you look at the promote, what would be the most kind of significant things that will be done under promote? How do you see that we can? I'll tell you maybe a bit of. Sanino invited me to speak at the External Action Service Summit this with all the ambassadors, and I asked them what kind of companies in technology do you know? And there was not so many, right? So how can what's the promote bit? How do we do the promote bit?
Well, you're asking sort of the wrong person, because of course being on the trade and investment side and dealing notably with strategic trade and strategic investment controls, I happen to be operationally more on the protect side. So I'm a protect kind of guy. but not it's not ideological or emotional.
Yeah.
Just functionally,
Yeah, yeah.
I'm on the protect
Yeah.
side. I think there's a suite of microeconomic policies in particular in terms of the calibrating of sectoral industrial policy type measures, innovation-related policies, whether it is fostering a research or research security, the two sides of the same coin. Skills, you mentioned this, which of course are the bedrock of, again, the competitiveness of the key sectors in the green and digital transition. And this is basically what the entirety of the promote universe. The protect side, in relation to this, I think is very targeted, or at least we see it in a very targeted manner. We are looking at the questions are relating to strategic trade controls or strategic investment controls, or certain instruments to level the playing field, with two objectives in mind. One is precisely filling the gaps in the level playing field, because the level playing field is not there for all kinds of reasons that have to do with insufficiency of the global trade rule book, etc. And a very specific issue relating to tech, in my view. This is why we are looking increasingly at things such as investment screening, inter alia, is the necessity to avoid the leakage of critical, in particular digital tech, to destinations of concern, in particular because we observe the spread of civil-military fusion strategies. Now, that's an essential security question, but of course it affects trade and investment, it affects, to some extent, integration. So the protect tools have got to be very targeted, and you need to have, and it's a fundamental principle in economic theory, one objective, one instrument, right? So you want to level the playing field, you have instruments dedicated to that. You want to avoid unwanted technology leakage, you can equip yourself, and we need to do it better at European level, that's the whole question, to those aspects as well.
Okay. Thank you so much. Let's turn to Anne. Anne, you definitely know about Promote and opportunities. So you are working every day. I mean, you're first of all digital savvy and know everything about digital policies, but now you're working on energy tech. We used to be like really strong leaders in energy tech. In wind, we are still leading as long as it might last. But we do see that in many areas we're lacking behind the Chinese. Will we still have a strong position in wind or other areas in 10 years? And what are the opportunities that are out there?
It's a good question. It's actually why I went from digital tech to clean tech, because I thought, after 20 years in digital tech, I sort of gave up and thought, let's pivot to something where Europe can really be a leader. That was just 4 years ago. And now, unfortunately, I have to say, while there is a lot of promise, there are also many challenges. So you spoke about wind. Which, of course, for you coming from Denmark, you know a lot about. Wind was, of course, stood up in Europe, was painstakingly built up here with a lot of R&D funding some 4 decades ago, even longer. Last year, I got very engaged in wind, even though I work on emerging clean technologies. Wind is a mature technology, but why did I do that? I wrote an op-ed last August, essentially to ring the alarm bell that this was yet another sort of industrial policy disaster in the making, because even though we said we would double down on renewables, which of course includes wind, even though in a next generation EU significant funds were earmarked for renewables, our own wind industry was essentially on its knees. We were really at risk last year of losing the wind industry. And that is, of course, after already having lost the solar industry. And I just couldn't understand why no one was saying anything about this, because that was obviously very troublesome. So we haven't turned it around, but at a minimum, we now have some awareness. Some of you may know that we got the European wind power package underway. Last year, President von der Leyen mentioned wind in her State of the Union. So a lot kicked in. Nonetheless, wind has now, if you look globally, Chinese wind turbine manufacturers have about anywhere between, I would say, 65 to 70% of the global market share. So we are not strongly positioned at the moment. So our own company, Siemens Gamesa, Vestas, Nordex, Enercon, also GE Vernova, even though GE is an American company, we count them as a European company because they have very sizable manufacturing facilities in Europe. They're all under extreme pressure, loss-making. This is for a continent that has said we're doubling this. Renewables is our sort of, backbone of the energy transition. How is that possible? How on earth is that possible, right? And that is the conundrum. Part of that is an unlevel playing field. However, Chinese have not sold yet a lot of wind turbines in Europe. But you mentioned it, a really slow permitting. It takes years from selling a wind turbine to actually being deployed. I mean, there's so many hurdles underway, right? And that's in the meantime, you have inflation, you have COVID, you have broken down supply chains. So very, very difficult for our manufacturers. No one really paying attention, and this is essentially why I, at the time, rang. Is the audio bad? It's okay.
I think the audio is back. Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, okay. So, but, and of course, we also don't have an external industrial policy. So at most, we think about our own market, but the growth markets are outside of Europe, right? I mean, so we don't do that well. I've been advocating for years that we need an external industrial policy because the EU market, while sizable, is peanuts in the scheme of things. So we need to do that better. If I look at what is needed now, I mean, the opportunity is that we keep the industry afloat, even though I will say that most of them have scaled back global ambitions, so they're hoping to keep the European market. Also, the Americans are buying our wind turbines, also for security reasons. Every wind turbine has about 300 sensors. They plug right into the power grid, so there is an element here of also protection of critical infrastructure, very important. What is needed? We need to invest in the electricity grid. I mean, it's crazy to build an offshore wind farm, but don't have the grid to bring the power to land. So something so basic, but we are not doing that in many cases. We need massive investments in the power grid. We need to accelerate the permitting for renewables, but also for grids and also for industrial manufacturing facilities. Or the permitting is still too slow. We see improvements, but still, and also not digitalized, by the way. There are studies done on how permitting is done. In many countries, this is a paper-based process that takes years. I mean, you can't make this up. I mean, this is really where we should be digging in. I spoke about the level playing field, which is actually quite unlevel, and we need to really focus the innovation, not just on the R&D, which we do well, but on the scaling up and the commercialization. This is where Europe falls short, and it is for me heartbreaking to see, after having experienced this in digital technologies, that I'm witnessing it yet again in clean tech. We need to, this is Europe's weak spot. It's not in the early stages of the innovation cycle, it's in the later stages, scaling up commercialization. If we don't do that better, we'll turn ourselves into really an incubator for the world. It's really bad return on research money if we don't get this straight. And this is not unknown. I've been working for this for well over a decade, and why we cannot get our hands around how to do this better is beyond me.
Yeah, but I also hear that you say there are opportunities. If we can speed up the permits, maybe we could do like an European permit system that are automized. I don't know. So there are things that we can do that would actually move this forward, right? And I guess this is where we're focusing, right? Yeah?
Digitalization of the public sector as a massive emergency. I mean, really, this needs to happen, not just for permitting, but across the board, digitalization of the public sector, an external industrial policy, regulation that doesn't just control, but seeks to unleash forces, entrepreneurial forces, forces of innovation. You know, this can be done differently, and it's about time that we do it.
Perfect. A call for action here. Let's turn to, we hear, the word over and over again in, international markets, partnering, geopolitical tensions. So, Luc van Middelaar, you are the founder of the Brussels Institute of Geopolitics. It's founded by, I think, 7 member states and more to come, hopefully. And it's really looking at geopolitics and how the dynamics are changing and what we can do about it. So you are talking about that Europe needs to think in terms of power, interest, strategy. What do you mean by that, and what does it mean for economic security?
Thank you, Cecilia. I think what we aim to achieve as a small catalyst, like yourselves and others in this ecosystem here in Brussels, is to accelerate Europe's strategic awareness, to understand as Europe also the bigger picture in which all of these discussions on economic security are taking place. If you zoom out a little bit, basically times have changed, and one way to sum it up is to say geopolitics is back. We have seen with the war in Ukraine the return of war on the European continent. We see also after 3 decades of globalization, more or less frictionless, a return of great power rivalry between the US and China, not to mention all kinds of other security and strategic challenges. And Europe and the EU is not so well equipped to deal with these challenges, to deal with an environment where it is more and more also power, state power, which determines outcomes or motives of actors more than sometimes rules or values. And that is understandable, knowing where Europe is coming from. Post 1945, 1989, all of that, end of history, understandable. Europe has pushed for this world of multilateral organizations, free trade, etc. But in today's landscape, we may come across as either naive or easily outcompeted, and I think that is very worrisome. Bringing it more concretely also to the issue of economic security, I think that is the heart of many of these discussions, and there, of course, the key element in all those I mentioned is the US-China rivalry. It is in all your slides and all your comparisons in this great report, highly recommended. It's about Europe, China, and the US. But our 2 main competitors are also not only active in the game on AI, biotech, quantum, semicon, be the best, have the largest market share. They're also in a game of being the number 1 in the world as such. They have a strategic drive, public and private, in this power race, I would say. And it means that for both Washington and Beijing, foreign policy and security considerations give an extra push to what they want to achieve. In more R&D, in more state aid, more investment, different trade and other strategic partnerships with partners across the globe. And of course for Europe, that has double impact, not only as we know by now that the old international multilateral globalization order is under huge pressure, and we try to uphold it as we should, because that is indeed, and I agree, within our interest. But it also means that our 2 main industrial technological competitors, they bring this extra drive, they bring this sense of urgency and dynamism to that battle, which is about power, about their place in history, about being number 1 in the world. And for us, it's sometimes even difficult to understand, but we should be aware of that, to not be each time surprised, and to also inject more urgency, as Anne and yourself also advocate, into our take on all of this.
So interesting. So is it a little bit like you were saying, like we have 2 states that are They are rivals at, with their states, and the private sector is like, following the states. But here in Europe, we are still like fighting, public sector and private sector. We're trying to regulate each other, and we still live in the same world of, if we prevent private sector from doing something, this is only good. Are we not following? We don't get the game.
Well, I think
Don't get the game have changed.
I mean, of course, here you have to make distinction between China and US. I mean, China is always about the state, basically, at heart, and state-owned enterprises, etc. I think the key difference for us in Europe to come to terms with is the way the US is changing and the way the United States is doing industrial policy, for instance, and recreating strong public-private connections. Inflation Reduction Act is just one element in this. There are many others and the United States is no longer upholding the international trade order we cherish. And maybe it started to some extent under the Trump administration, but that movement has continued under the current Biden administration. It will no doubt continue, whoever wins on the 5th of November, the presidential election. So that it means that for us Europeans, we are more lonely in that world in upholding that liberal order, and we should get used to it. And it also means that, probably you will need to find ways also here within the Brussels discussion on public funding for strategic investments in various sectors which you have identified, and where, of course, then it will be a matter of not backing losers, as it was called in the old days, but picking winners and be very selective and all of that. But the whole game is changing there, driven again by geostrategic dynamics of US and China. I think that has been underestimated, and that movement will only intensify as we look a decade or two ahead, if I may.
Yeah, super interesting. So let's take this from the geopolitical. The game is changing. The world of rule-based trade order is, falling apart. And take it all the way down to company level, right? Or up to company level, we could say. Live in the real world. You need to compete in this world. You need to grow. You need to innovate across border. So, Catherine, you are the head of political affairs and government relations at Bosch. And you are also one of the largest producers of semiconductors for the automotive industry. So we have seen in the study that we are not game on, as a total industry on semiconductors. We have the CHIPS Act. Maybe your judgment call of whether this is enough. Is it good enough? Does it work? And is there anything else that Europe can do in this game?
Thanks a lot, Cecilia, and thanks for having me. Indeed, I mean, Bosch is a producer also of semiconductors. We've just announced last year our cooperation also with ESMC, Infineon, and NXP to build a new fabric in Dresden. I mean, some years ago, Europe decided to step out of the production of the small, not sized chips at that time, that was microchips. And what we see today is the result of the decision many years ago. So we have to catch up in this field. I mean, our investments, they help, but they're not enough. We need more investments like this, like on the front end manufacturing and semiconductor production. We are not very good in Europe, so we have to catch up. But of course, we shouldn't see everything just negative. There are some strengths in Europe that we have in the semiconductor supply chain, for example, in specialized materials, sensor and power electronics. We have a significant user application capability in the automotive industry, ASML. We have the strong machinery equipment for semiconductor production. So we do have some strengths. And we should also focus on our strengths to further strengthen them, because I think we have to accept in Europe that we will never be self-reliant. We have to partner with other countries, but I think it's easier to partner if everybody has something to bring to the negotiation table. So we have to strengthen also our own strengths. So we have something to bring to the table to negotiate, and we have to look for partnerships with reliable partners, because we still be dependent on in the semiconductor supply chain. I mean, the chip is traveling 2 to 3 times around the whole world before it's completely finalized. So the supply chain is extremely complex, and that's something we have to accept. But at the same time, we need more, as I said, we need more investment. So we need targeted large-scale funding. Skills, I think were mentioned many, many times. We have to invest in skills in Europe. Yeah, and partnering as well.
Yeah. So one follow-up question here. So you read the economic security strategy. You participated also in the study. If you look and be bold. So if you look at the economic security strategy, are there some of these measures in that paper coming out of the Commission that will help you to grow? Or are there other policy tools that you see that would be... So, I mean, you live in the real world, right?
Yeah.
You need to make a living, you need to innovate. So what would help you? What would move the needle?
I mean, as was mentioned before, there is a lot of focus at the moment on the protect field, which from a global company perspective, that's not the field where we should put the most focus on. I think we will not win if we have a very defensive approach. I mean, there's many men and probably football fans in the world, but if you look, for example, at England, great team, great players, probably the best players, but they play very defensive. Let's see if they win the Euros, but I have my doubts. Sorry. And you can tell me afterwards for this.
Yesterday due to the match.
There's probably many, many more football experts in the room, but I just really feel like we should focus really much more on the promotion and partnering angle from a company perspective. Of course, there might be some trade measures that are necessary, but then really think about they have to be targeted, they have to be temporary, and really solution-oriented. They always have reactions. And for companies, sometimes there are reactions from third countries, which are, for us, our export countries. So that's extremely tricky. So yes, you can maybe have some protect elements, but be careful. And that's why we also appreciate with the Commission that you do take the time to analyze at the moment. I mean, so far there were only communications, nothing set in stone yet, and see what is missing and what we need to do. But do focus on the promotion, regulation that helps and doesn't just put a lot of bureaucracy onto companies. Also, some of the measures, outbound investment screening, they will create a lot of bureaucracy for companies. Some of the measures, they are in our own interest. We are doing them anyway. We are screening extremely carefully our supply chain diversification. So just, be careful what else. Yeah. The burden that you put on companies in this field.
So I think what exactly we are saying here is that thank you for only doing a paper of communication. Read this book before you start doing something. So, yes, thank you so much. I think it's very important, actually, maybe next time on the panel we should start by the company from the real world. What's your biggest problem and how can we help you? I think I'm going to do that next time. Anyway, now let's move to interactive. Did you all do the Slido thing? Yeah? Can we have the Slido up again so we can scan it? Please? Yes. So we will ask you now, and everybody online, if you are been able to take a picture of the code, then we will pose some questions here. Which measures are most suitable to enhance European economic security to increase our competitiveness? Very uncomplicated short question. So, in short, what should we do to become more competitive? So here we go. Streamline regulation, less reporting burden, pan-European procurement, skills, tax incentives, private-public partnership. We'll wait. We'll give it 1 or 2 more minutes. Interesting. Now we're going to wait a little bit because we need that info on stage here to continue the next question, right? Will it look stable now? We'll give it half a minute more. The picture is so right now it looks very much like taking this spaghetti bowl of all the regulation and making sure that it's ironed out and easy to find your way through the jungle of spaghetti regulation, and that we remove all this reporting and the endless amount of reporting burden on companies that sometimes does not lead really to any kind of action, that this is really the number one. I'm actually surprised about that. but that maybe shows how much we actually. I looked at the numbers. Companies use like 2.3% of revenue for R&D in average, and I think we use 2.5 on compliance cost.
Yeah.
I mean, so the tipping point between R&D and compliance is basically has turned. So, and I think this is a very strong message that I send here. Then education and skills. We need the people, we need the skills. So, dear member states, it's not something that the EU can solve. Please get your act together and make sure that we educate the right people. And then we have large-scale infrastructure investment, private-public partnership projects, tax incentives, and targeted funding from institutions like EIB and other. Okay, super. Okay, and then it says partnerships with other countries on raw material. So listen, I think the statement of at least the top ones is quite clear. We'll continue with the survey as we continue with the panel also. So let me go the other way around now. So Catherine, I'll start with you and say, like, you have been interviewed as a part of the study. What is striking that Europe struggles to leverage big capital investments. We saw that also here. We also struggle to have big companies, the small fishes that we saw before. What's the solution? How can we make Europe more attractive? How can we get more money in the hands of companies? And how can the small fishes become big fishes?
Very good question. I think, to be honest, the answer was on the slide before with all the answers. We have to make Europe attractive. I mean, the regulation topic is definitely a topic. I mean, I'm also in close contact with our board of management, and they do observe very carefully what's happening, and they do realize what is happening in Europe, and also compared to other regions. We need the large-scale funding to attract companies here in Europe. We also need to have the skills, as I said, also retain talent that we have to make Europe also an attractive place for the talent to stay here. We have a venture capital. I mean, compared to the US, the access to venture capital in Europe is much, much lower. Maybe that's something that we also need to work on. Yeah, I think we can start with that.
Yeah, good question. Yeah. To the point. So, Luc, going back to the big picture again, right? So, is there any chance that Europe can become like a geopolitical powerhouse? And what are how and will we collaborate with allies to do that? I mean, to enhance capabilities of strength of partners.
Well, I think the allies or partnerships question is very relevant, but it also comes second. It's really relevant because, of course, it's about EU-US cooperation. It's about partnerships for critical raw materials, also with countries, Central Asia, Latin America, and Africa, and so on. But I think before we look at all these partnerships and tools, it's also a question of, and partners in the rest of the world, what do we want ourselves? Huh? What is our view, our strategy? And I think when I look not at your document, but at some of the Commission's documents, if I may say so, Denis, it's a real, you feel like the pleasure of, right, we have this great toolkit, we have all the instruments, we have the FDI, outward investment screening, all kinds of things we can do. But what is missing, I feel, in the conversation about this, is what for? What do we actually want to achieve in this big picture, in this history as it is unfolding between US, China, rest of the world? What actually are the risks that we consider most important? De-risking is a great term, it's very consensual, we can all agree, but what actually is the risk? And the agenda this afternoon is a great agenda of, let's say, economic strength with all the means we can bring to bear to that, and have your big fish, and have a single market, and have foreign partners. But then I think the question is, once we have that economic strength and bring it to economic security, how do we use that strength? Do we use it offensively? For instance, vis-à-vis China, which seems to me a little bit the elephant in the room. Economic security strategy is also a China strategy, even if we don't say so here. In Washington, they would say so openly, sans gêne. Or do we have an economic security strategy which is more, let's say, defensive in the sense, okay, we just protect one of your T's, and which is an important one. That is some more clarity or political conversation on this underlying objectives, even if, of course, that is a difficult and fraught discussion, but it might help to have a less ambiguous, a more straightforward view of what we actually want to achieve, and from there on, you can then also choose your partners, knowing who you are, what you want, where you want to go. And we feel at our institute, and we want to delve into that in our next research and papers after the summer, is a conversation we should start having also in Brussels and in the EU more widely.
Yeah. I did hear Vestager before actually saying, well, you know, we are actually trying with EU, US, but also with the G7 to basically shape that new community of, you know, of power or friends, right? Somehow. But yeah, okay, at least that's one bold move, or a move at least, right? But it's totally right. What's the strategy? Why are we doing all this? Just because we can, or because we need to do something bigger? Yeah.
Exactly.
So I'm looking forward to that report. So let's jump back to you, Dennis, before we go to you, Anne. So you and DG Trade has had a huge role to play here, and in both in terms of partnering, but also protect. Of course, as you said, I'm a kind of protect guy. So our study shows that these restrictive measures will have like a backlash. It will definitely not boost the economics. So do you think it will weaken companies also, and will it make us too defensive? And finally, can you give us a little bit of insight on where the member states are on their, because you asked the member states, like do a risk assessment. So if you can give us a little bit of insight into that too.
Let me try to answer that question by starting by saying I completely agree actually what Luc was saying, and I was not saying anything different. An economic security strategy is about giving definition to what do we need to de-risk and why. Now, the problem is you can't define this in abstract and then deploy. You have to, it's in the implementation of the economic security strategy and its different work streams that we're going to identify the calibration of that de-risking. And yes, in large part, this is about de-risking our economy from China. There's no problem in saying this. Yes, inter alia, it is about that. Now, that requires having a risk assessment and a risk mitigation set of frameworks. And that's why at the core of the economic security strategy lies these risk assessment exercises that in a setting like ours, which is the European Union, which is not a unitary state, you need to do incrementally between the EU institutions and the member states. And doing this iteratively is what we need to continue doing. So it's not something that you do once and you stop. It's something that will be happening progressively and giving definition to de-risking as we produce those outcomes. So that's how I think we see this. By the way, linked to this is the question of how we do this, not just not being a unitary state, but also being a market economy. I mean, yes, there is more government intervention in the economy, but we are not a state capitalist economy. We are a market economy. So, therefore, the whole question is how do we create a pathway for calibrated, meaningful, and sensible de-risking where we need to de-risk with the private sector? Most of these issues will have to be done through, first of all, a granular understanding of what industry and economic operators need and how they operate in complex value chains. And there's a lot of work that needs to go into this. Second, that out of government, so to speak, whether it is at EU level or at national level, depending on where the division of competence lies, that we are able to give the right signals and the right incentives that are going to produce a result. Because in a market economy, we don't set the conditions for trade out of the state. The companies trade and invest. So we have to find the right way to create the right incentives. Therefore, it requires a sort of public-private partnership, which I think, frankly, today is still very much in the making. And we have some frameworks at EU level, but it requires a level of granularity and co-construction that we still have to find. And by the way, we can get inspirations from other jurisdictions in doing. We are very interested, for example, to see how a country like Japan is developing an economic security strategy, because there is a very interesting interaction, historically, traditionally, between parts of government and the private sector, for example. In some cases, it is easier. I mean, we do have trade restrictive measures when we deploy this form of economic statecraft, which is, for example, in the face of a big geopolitical crisis, economic sanctions on Russia. There, it's a little bit simpler. Sanctions, you comply, right? When it comes to, yes, and some people will find it difficult because there are complexities with compliance, over compliance, interpretation, etc. But we provide predictability in a sense. What is difficult is when, of course, we are dealing with something which is less clear-cut, which is on a scale, and that's the question of de-risking, because there the predictability is not easy to give from the public sector to the private sector. I think it's all these things that we're going to have to, that we need to figure out as we construct the thing. I'm not sure I've actually answered your question.
I think
I just said things.
No, but you. So yes and no. Partly you did.
All right.
And one thing I did learn is that
partly is not too bad. I mean.
No, partly is okay. It's okay. We'll get to the rest. Okay. But no, joke aside. But what you did say is that there is still this kind of and for us, I think something that we like to hear, and we think that this is what is lacking. Somehow Europe has not found this dance. You know, we published a paper called The Love Story Between the Companies and the Single Market, right? Somehow that love story is a bit rusty, right? We're not totally in love with the single market. We don't think it's real. And, we would like it. So a little bit more love. And what you said, I think you said the EU, and we haven't still found that how to have a much closer dialogue with private sector.
Yeah, and probably both the promote and the protect, by the way. I mean, I take good note of what you say on how we need to cater for bringing industry into the whole discussion of the promote side. Yeah. I argue that the same applies for the protect side, because I think you can't implement the protect. I mean, the first line of defense, of course, in a market economy are the economic operators through due diligence, for example. And at the same time, also understand that we cannot put all the burden of what we want to achieve as a state, as public authorities, on companies. Because if not, you create a level playing field problem. And that's also well understood.
It needs to be with companies, but thank you so much for that. And then turning to Anne. Anne, of course, I mean, you've been in the Commission for many, many years. You know how it works. A word of advice, if you look at the approach that is taken now, 2 good advices from you now, also being on the private sector side and looking from the views of companies. What could we easily do that makes this easier?
My strong recommendation is that we don't we always tend to look forward, but it's worthwhile to look back. And if I look back, I see a very open, and I'm sorry, Dennis, in a little bit naive trade policy, keeping markets very open without reciprocity in other markets. I see a very, very strict state aid policy, sending our own companies out there to compete on a very unlevel playing field in very open markets with subsidized competitors. And of course, and you mentioned it in your introductory remarks, even though cost is always the overriding factor in public procurement, then I only have one question. Why do we impose on our own companies the highest taxes, the highest regulatory burden, the highest compliance cost, the highest wages, the highest non-wage labor cost, the highest energy prices, and then are really surprised if after a decade or 15 years of this, they cannot compete? You know, I mean, surprise. So my point is, let's not pretend we are starting from scratch. I mean, we need to learn from past mistakes. I think this is why we're having this discussion here today. And understand that we are now in a weak spot because we have built up terrible dependencies. Coming back to wind, you cannot produce wind turbines in Europe without Chinese components, whether that's rare earth, whether that's permanent magnets, which we have lost the ability to do here in Europe. So, you know, we are today in a very tough spot. You spoke about my 5 years in the Commission. After those 5 years, I had one insight. And that is that the world is engaged in a competition for technology supremacy. And I use the word supremacy purposefully, because those that will have the supremacy, and if they are ill-intentioned, can weaponize these dependencies and will weaponize these dependencies. And they will really can use coercion vis-a-vis us. And I think this is what we're feeling now. So no policy will be a silver bullet. We are in bad shape. This is a very serious moment. And that's why I'm saying, let's not pretend we're starting here from scratch. There is something that led us here that hasn't worked, that we need to do better. And this is my plea for the next Commission is, you know, we speak about streamlined regulation, but I think what people are really asking for in companies is really aligned policy making, where we have aligned trade policy with state aid policy, with industrial policy, with energy policy, research and innovation policy, really as a holistic policy that makes sense. Where not one part of the house is doing one thing and another is doing another thing, and it doesn't add up. And our companies in the middle can't compete at home or abroad, right? So this is where we are. And let me say, I deplore when we speak about China and the United States in the same vein. I can tell you that the Americans are buying our 5G. The Americans are buying our wind turbines. They have much better instincts about economic security than we have, where price and competition and open markets have always been, you know, sort of the mantra. And this is what got us here today. Where they bought European, we bought Chinese. So let's be very clear about this, right? And this is why we are in this situation today. Also, deserves to be mentioned that the Americans are providing our security guarantees, without which we are just a backyard of Russia and China. So this is very serious what we are talking about here. And to the extent that Europe has any sovereignty, it really comes from our economic standing. We are a political dwarf. You know, people used to say we're an economic giant and a political dwarf. We are well on the way to being a political dwarf and an economic dwarf. And then you want to see what kind of sovereignty we are going to enjoy. So these are very serious times. Thank you for your report. The last thing I will say is next time around, please also look at all the digital threats we are exposed to, the espionage, the surveillance, the cyber attacks we are subject to, the online disinformation, because you need to add all that on top of what you described here, right? So this is a very serious moment, and this is a very serious discussion. Thank you for initiating it.
Yeah. So there is never a panel without Anne where she summarized much better than the facilitator. And I mean, perfect. What can I say now apart from thank you? No, until I say thank you, just one thing. I think you're right, Anne, and I think that that's maybe the conclusion. We keep on pushing. I mean, we are privileged people, all of us sitting here, we're super privileged. There's a world out there of citizens that needs to live in the world. There are our kids that needs to live in the world and hopefully in a safe Europe. These are serious times, and the choice of this commission and their ability to act and take cool decisions where we act as one team and not as 27 different teams will determine how the future looks on digital critical technologies, but also on our financial stability and our military stability. So with that, let's all take the responsibility of driving this forward. Let's be concrete in how we do our recommendations. It's also industry's role to basically make very concrete recommendations. Untangling the spaghetti ball of all the regulations, as I said, next week for us. It's supposed to be a staff away day. It's in a nice place, but we're going to work on exactly that. And we'll definitely be back. And as we see here, maybe one question from the audience. Do we have the time? Okay, we have the time. So, isn't investing in our strength a defensive strategy? Couldn't we play offense and invest in our weaknesses to win the AI race? So that's one question, and you can decide who would take. I will give it to you, Catherine, right? And then another one is there a risk siloed thinking in the European Commission? With DG Trade focusing at protective measures, is economic diplomacy with like-minded partners actually on the table? So I think that's for you. So as I cannot do more than two, I'm going to give it to Catherine and to you, Dennis. Catherine, go.
So the first question, is it a defensive strategy to only invest in our strengths? I'm not saying we should only invest in our strengths. We should definitely also try to catch up on where we have weaknesses. But what I would also wanted to say is we shouldn't forget about our strengths. So we should be realistic. We can't be self-reliant. We can't do everything in Europe. So we have to really very smartly see where we focus on. It is catching up, but also focus on our strengths so to do have some kind of negotiation power going forward. That's what I want to say.
And I think one of the things, I mean, in business, we talk about core business, right? You know, in up times, we go a little bit wild, then we invest in a little bit of everything, and if it goes well, it's super. But then if there is a recession, we go back to core biz. What's your core business, right? So you're saying right now we're in a situation where it's core biz. Focus on core biz and win that game. Dennis. Is there a silo thinking? Do we actually have promote an active outreach to partners and all these things on the table? Is this happening, actively, executed?
There's always a risk of silo thinking in government. That I can assure you. We do try not to be totally, stupid either. The question of whether DigiTrade risk focusing only on protective measures, no. I think DigiTrade essentially believes in shoring up the integration of the European economy in the global economy. Because again, it starts with openness. The basis for our competitiveness is our insertion in the global economy. As it happens, we also now have to deal with pockets where it requires some de-risking. But both, it's not one or the other. You have to do both. So I think the risk of us drifting into a protection in the sense of protectionist direction is simply not there because it's not in the European interest to do that, to put it as simple as possible. Economic diplomacy with like-minded partners on the table, of course there is. And you mentioned when you were in conversation with Margrethe Vestager, the initiatives that have taken place in this area with a range of like-minded parties. I'm thinking, for example, about the Trade and Technology Council with the United States, which is exactly about this, which is exactly about how do we navigate this without having unnecessary regulatory divergences, and on the contrary, produce regulatory convergence to build safer, more integrated markets. That's exactly what is the order of business for continued economic diplomacy out of the European Union.
Yeah. So just a small provocative comment there. I come from a very small country, but I used to be, for 9 years, they actually gave me this very honorable position of being the head of the Royal Export Grant Committee of Denmark. And one of the things that I saw was that there was a lot of noise, right, until it reached the companies. So when I think about economic diplomacy, even though I know it's meant well, the TDC for me is a policy, I would call it a policy economic diplomacy. I think when we talk about economic diplomacy, we think how can we actually actively promote companies in the market? direct promotion of real companies in market. You know, the English have been masters. Still remember a meeting with them, I think 15 years ago, listening to their strategy of how they support their companies externally. They've been super at that. US does it magnificently. But you know, real economic diplomacy, is that something that is like one of the tools that we are looking at? Yes, sorry.
I'll give you a very concrete answer to this, taking the example of wind. What we do for the wind sector of DG Trade is not applying protective measures on the EU market. As a matter of fact, as you said, in the wind sector, we don't actually have a surge in imports on the EU market. What we're trying to do is support big EU players in this area to be globally competitive in markets where there are opportunities to participate in deployment. We're doing this, for example, in Asia. We have worked enormously on the offensive side of the strategy, on the promote side of the strategy, to make sure that the regulatory approaches that are being developed in Japan on wind, for offshore wind, are regulatory approaches that are not going to be adverse to the interests of the European manufacturers, but on the contrary, are going to enable them to participate in deployment. And the second round of tenders in Japan has shown that they are getting a stake of the deployment. So that's the kind of economic diplomacy that we have in mind as well for the key sectors in green tech.
Super. I'm going to round off this panel, I think, just by saying I heard some really good tones in how do we actually also on the protective side, you know, bring companies in the room and have a dialogue. I'll take you up on that. So the companies are here, they're members. We'd really like to sit down around the table and talk about, take one P at a time, right? And say, how can we do this? How can we do? What will actually benefit us? How can we, you know, as a good European warriors, you know, be supported in this fight between giants and actually get out alive? So how can we actually do that, and with what tools? So Dennis, I'll take you up on that. I also hear a cry from Anne saying, "It's now." It's now. There is no. I mean, honestly, I used to be a CEO of a company. I went to Asia. I lived in China for a while. When I come back, nobody realized that there was a huge consolidation in everything that was called application. That was over. Nobody spoke about it. For me, it was like the reality. It was obvious. No one in the political system spoke about that consolidation phase. It was non-existing on the agenda, but it meant that we lost hundreds of thousands of companies in Europe because there was a consolidation and we didn't even know. This is time. This is the last consolidation phases, and we need to get our act together. And I hear from Catherine saying, you know, when you are in times of recession, focus on your strength. Don't go crazy and wild on stuff that where you cannot lead. I also heard earlier on quantum, for example, where we lead in research, commercialize. Let companies lead that effort. And from Luke, you said it's happened already. I mean, we have a US that is not keeping the rules. We have a China that's not keeping the rules. We're stuck in the middle. We need to start playing the game that is being played already instead of living in a world of perfectionism that doesn't exist. And from my side, I would just say, without having value, there are no values that will survive.